Yay, we're here. Woo! Well, welcome anyone joining along at home. I am so excited to be talking to Ruth today. Ruth, can you give us a little bit of an intro about who you are and your book?
Sure. Yeah. So I am, my name's Ruth Whippman. I am a journalist and an author. And I'm a mom of three boys. And my most recent book is called BoyMom, Reimagining Boyhood in the Age of Impossible Masculinity. And it's a combination of memoir, so my own experience raising three sons, and also the sort of biggest part of it is a kind of cultural investigation into masculinity in our extremely fraught, extremely scary political moment that we're living through, and what it means to be a boy, to raise a boy, to, be a man, etc., etc., in these times.
Yeah, I've been wanting to talk to you so badly about this. I was terribly aware of my own bias reading the opening
Oh,
to
gosh.
Boy Mom. Yeah.
Yeah. What was your bias? I'm so
Well,
fascinated.
I just really identify, you express some of your internal conflict just with your feminist side
Yes.
and so that really I resonated deeply with that. So
Yeah, it's a
so
really conflicted space. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, give listeners a little bit of a taste of like where you were at when you realized it's necessary to write this book.
Okay, so the book opens and it is like late 2017, and I am 972 months pregnant with my third boy. And as I'm sort of like lying there on the bed, like kind of glugging my Pepto Bismol and like losing my mind, out in the world, the Me Too movement is just kicking off, or just sort of well, probably it's wrong to say just kicking off because it has a long history prior to this, but, just really exploding.
Mhm.
And Weinstein is exposed. And within 10 days, it sort of seems like we've gone from like this one terrible, terrible man as a sexual predator to like every man in America is a sexual predator. Everyone you've ever watched on TV, every beloved celebrity, everybody, and it's just this sort of sense of this like sewage, like pouring out onto the streets. And there I am, about to be a mom of three boys. I'm a feminist, a lifelong feminist. I've devoted much of my career and my life to advocating for women and girls, to thinking about things from the perspective of women and girls. And I'm just suddenly like terrified.
Uh-huh.
How do we raise good men? What do I do about raising my boys? And that obviously seems to be something like really normalized in the culture, that like sexual assault is not just, or just sort of sexual violence in general. It's not just like a few bad men. It's something deeply systemic in the culture that we've allowed to happen as a society. We've normalized it. And like, I was sort of there thinking like nobody wants, I'm sure Harvey Weinstein's mom, or, whoever's Louis C.K.'s mom, no one goes out and thinks, I really want to raise a predator. This is happening sort of in some ways beyond our own individual control. There's a lot of blind spots. So I was just like very, very frightened about how to take on this task, but also at the same time, like pretty kind of, there was something really defensive in me, like the language that people were using, talking about men and boys and being toxic. And it was just this idea that boys were just like these kind of predators in waiting. And the best we could do is like limit the damage and, make them be not quite as terrible as they were destined to be. That felt like a really, really psychologically unhealthy environment for my boys, who obviously
Yeah.
I loved and wanted to advocate for. And it also seemed like things weren't really working out so well for them either. The system didn't really seem to be providing them with a really emotionally healthy way to grow up. And it seemed to be depriving them of certain things. So it was just this very, very conflicted space that I wanted to make sense of in my personal life, and just sort of as a journalist as well, to just kind of understand, what's going on here? How did we get here? How can we do better? What does it mean to be a boy and to raise a boy in these times?
Yeah, totally. I feel like so much of the masculinity discourse, it's like swinging between these
Yeah.
extremes of like boys are broken now, like,
Yeah.
now we're in 2026 and now it's boys are broken or boys are under attack. So like
Right. Yeah.
where have you landed in your perspective, and, like, what is getting lost when we are arguing in these, like, absolutes?
Yeah, I mean, I think that everyone is kind of talking a zero-sum game, often both on the right and on the left. So on the right, you hear this like terrible, rhetoric, which is like feminism to blame. Women are,
Mhm,
and feminism is to blame, and often like women are to blame for men's downfall, and men are the real victims, and men are disadvantaged, and all of this sort of feminist thought is just kind of BS, and this kind of rage, this entitlement, this sense of like men deserve to be on top, and and anything else is an attack on men. And then on the other hand, you sort of get rhetoric, and look, these are not equivalent. I'm not saying these are like morally equivalent, but you do hear on the left more of a kind of like, in some circles, a kind of like, why even advocate for boys? Like that, boys don't really have any problems. It's just a kind of entitlement that, they're just like bad. And Richard Reeves puts it, they don't have any problems. They are the problem, And so there's no empathy, or very little empathy, for the problems of men and boys. There's very little goodwill towards them. It's just like they are the enemy. And
mhm,
I think that's really not helpful. And I think what gets lost is like, there is a very rich history of a discourse on the left, which is that patriarchy harms men too. The system
mhm.
that harms women and girls also simultaneously harms men and boys. And perhaps now more than ever, in a way, and I think advocating for boys is not like running counter to the feminist project. Advocating for boys is absolutely part of the feminist project.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about that. Like, your
Yeah.
feminist instincts and, like, the realities of parenting sons, and, like, maybe a time or 2 when those bumped up against each other and really, like, made you rethink things.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've sort of had this series of internal conflicts right from the start. I mean, I think I went into the project of like parenting boys. I grew up with a very feminist mother, a feminist of the 1970s, quite dogmatic, variety,
Mhm.
no pink, no Barbies, no, And I grew up with this very strong sense that like all differences between boys and girls are socialized rather than rooted in biology. So this idea that, it was all nurture rather than nature, and that the reason why boys and men behave badly is because we kind of encourage them socially to do that, that that we coddle them, that we allow them to kind of get away
Mhm.
with it. We just sort of say boys will be boys and like shrug our shoulders. And when I had my own boys, I was like, I went into it being like really kind of like hubristic and thinking, my boys are going to be these like sensitive, then I'm never going to like tolerate bad behavior. They're going to just want to do arts and crafts all day and be interested in literature. And, they're not going to be those like rough, nasty boys. And then obviously, parenting doesn't go that way. And my boys were the most boyish, the most wild, the most loving of Nerf guns and fighting and play fighting. And they were the wildest in every, like, you couldn't take them to a restaurant because they would just like tear the place apart. And I feel like I spent so much energy trying to sort of like socialize them away from those behaviors, but like it just wasn't, I felt like I was really up against something so very immovable. And so I think that really challenged my perspective here. And this sort of like, I have a whole chapter on nature versus nurture. And a lot of it is just sort of working through something psychological for myself. Like, am I a failure because I cannot seem to turn out the sort of quiet, sensitive,
Mhm.
loving sons that, and this is more a feature of like when they were very little, but it did seem to be very, very real.
But one of the things you write about that I have 3 younger brothers that totally, I saw growing up was that, yes, my brothers could be, like, so boisterous
Yeah.
and out of control, and yet they were so gentle and
Absolutely.
sensitive in some ways.
It's all true. I think it's so true. I think sometimes people get quite overwhelmed by the physicality of boys. And again, look, I just want to be clear here. Not all boys, not all girls, not all,
Mhm.
we're talking like group level, top level differences,
Yeah,
men,
yeah.
women, exceptions, etc., etc. But I think there is a way in which, at a group level, boys generally tend to be more physically active than than girls do. And you're right. I mean, they also, and I think that can often become a way that as a culture we talk about boys that kind of tends to neglect their emotional needs and their sort of sensitivity. And, it's a way of being like, oh, you hear this phrase like, boys are like dogs. I don't know if you ever heard this, but
No.
when you have boys, you hear this all the time. It's like, oh, boys are like dogs. All they need is just like take them to the park, throw a ball at them, give them some food. Whereas like the idea is that girls are these like emotionally complex creatures that need so much. And I think it becomes a way to actually like neglect the emotional needs
Mhm.
boys, to frame it that way. My boys are incredibly sensitive, thoughtful, emotionally aware, and sometimes it gets kind of lost in the whole physicality of it. And like moment to moment, you're a bit like, everyone's like pulling down the curtains and play fighting and running around and, whatever it is. But they are extremely thoughtful. They have complex emotional needs. They have complex emotional responses. They're not like dogs. They're humans, complex humans.
I loved the service that you do to vulnerability in the book, and I would love, like, what did you learn about how we condition
Yeah.
boys away from that, and, like, how can we avoid doing that?
Yeah. So this was like the sort of central paradox. This was like one of the first things that I found out when I was like digging into the research. And it's something that really informed all of the rest of my thinking about boys and men and masculinity, which is that um boys are biologically, if there are any differences like that are really rooted in biology that are very, very, very substantiated by the research and the literature. The main one is not that boys are like more aggressive or more rambunctious or more whatever. It's that they are more emotionally sensitive and vulnerable at birth. And the reason for that is because when a baby boy is born, his brain is about a month to 6 weeks behind a baby girl's brain in terms of right brain development, which is the part that deals with emotional self-regulation, attachment,
Mhm.
relationships. So his brain is more immature. And when your brain is more immature, it is more vulnerable to disruption. So, in theory, a baby boy needs slightly more hands on care than a baby girl. If you think about it, like a month to 6 weeks in a baby is really quite a lot. And
Mhm.
so, it's more like you're dealing with a sort of premature baby than so a baby girl is slightly more resilient. But what ends up happening, so boy needs like a little more of that tender, hands-on, nurturing, positive touch, emotional regulation, help, etc. But because of our ideas about what boys are, what they need, what we project onto them about masculinity, we often end up giving them slightly less care. So it's
Mhm.
like, and you see it, you can kind of picture it, the way that people even handle baby boys. It's like they like throw them up in the air and they're like, "Hey there, little man," and go
Yeah,
and fight
smacking them on the back, yeah.
pat him on the back, and "Hey, little slugger," and call them buddy instead of sweetheart. All of this. And there's like psychology research that supports this, that people handle and talk to baby boys slightly differently. They talk to them slightly less. They give them slightly less nurturing care. Um, and this continues throughout life. So you get this like double whammy where boys like need slightly more and they get slightly less, and we try to toughen them up and we sort of neglect their emotional development in certain ways. And so the gap between boys and girls grows as they get older and older. So what starts off as a very small difference becomes
Mhm.
a much bigger difference as time goes on. And, you see it in the way that people talk to teenage boys and girls. You see it in the way that people talk to 5-year-old boys and girls, the way that they think about, the vulnerability of their daughters versus the vulnerability of their sons. And it feels like we've got it backwards almost.
What did you do, like, after learning that, how did you take that back to your sons and,
Myself.
like
Yeah. Well, so it actually was a really, really profound learning for me. And so it's sort of hard to encapsulate it in like one or
mm,
two like
yeah,
tips and
yeah.
tricks, but it was honestly a real fundamental reorientation in the way that I saw my children and what they needed and what they needed from me and their experience in the world. It really just opened my eyes to like, so one example is, and I write about this in the book, that when my first son started kindergarten, he was going through the gate and it was like his first day. He's really anxious. He's like, like every kid, starting school. And there's this like parent volunteer, a guy at the gate. And as every girl walks through, every 5-year-old girl walks through the gate, he says to them, like, "Hi, sweetheart," this very tender tone of
Mhm.
voice. And when my son walks through, and every boy, he's like, you know, puffs himself up to his full, like 6'4" height, and like his voice like goes down an entire octave, and he's like, "Hey there, buddy." And like, and I'm like, it just opened my eyes to like, this one moment in and of itself is a very, very minor kind of nothing burger, but it's like replicated thousands and thousands of times every day, every week. He's giving a very, very different, he's communicating something very different to the girls and the boys walking through that gate about who they are in the world, what they can expect from the adults in their life. And so with my own children, I think I suddenly became very aware of their experience in the world. And I suddenly became very aware of my own like bias that I was like, also, I mean, buddy's not really a British word, but I was doing the equivalent where I was kind of like, there was something different in the way that I was orientating towards them than I might have done had I had a daughter.
Yeah.
So I think and when and you see this, and you especially see it with boys of color and, um, Black boys in particular, that boys get funneled into, when their emotional needs come out, they often get funneled instead of being like responded to as a sort of um, kid with emotional needs, they get responded to as a kid with discipline problems, and they get funneled into these disciplinary tracks, and this builds and builds and builds. And I think with my own son, I started to see certain things. It's not like my role was not to like control their behavior and like punish them or give them reward. It was to respond to them as complex emotional beings who needed stuff from me, and to give them more care
Mhm.
and to connect with them and to see the relationship as the primary thing, and like what they need is connection. And what was really interesting to me was that when I started responding to them in that way, then their behavior improved. Like,
Yeah.
they actually became better able to be in the world and to tolerate these things, and more regulated. And
I even find, like, obviously, like, my husband's a man. He's not a boy anymore, but just, like, making space, it's like, it's not natural for him to cry. Like, it
yeah,
he spent so much time trying not to cry that, like,
yeah,
when it comes out, it's like,
yeah,
it fucks him up, and so just
yeah,
creating space for that
yeah.
can be just, like, a powerful.
It's really powerful. And I think what's been really interesting is like, I thought with a title like BoyMom, like no man would ever pick up this book in a million years. But actually, lots and lots of men have read it, and they've read it. Many of them have read it not so much as dads wanting to parent their sons, but as people, humans, thinking about their own childhood and how they were parented, and
Uh-huh.
their own relationship with emotions and sensitivity and vulnerability. But you're right, because every man pretty much who's, an adult now was raised in this way to a greater or lesser extent. Every man has a complicated relationship with masculinity, with emotions, with, what it's okay to express. And I think I interviewed a lot of boys for this book, what were then at the time like teenage boys and young adult, early 20s, college age. And they all said the same thing that you've described, which is just like at a certain point, if you suppress your emotions enough, it's like you have a hard time even identifying what they are. Like you're feeling
Mhm.
all this stuff and you can't even name it for yourself, let alone like share it with somebody else. And that's extremely unhealthy.
Yeah, totally. So as, I feel like the last year or it's like we're now moving into like this masculinity crisis. We can put our
Yeah.
finger on it. And here I just want to this is my own selfish. I want you to talk me through this.
Yeah.
So, this isn't, again, not about boys, more about men, but
Yeah.
I have to admit one of the things that I do see men are struggling, and I empathize with that so much. And one of the things that drives me fucking insane about the men are struggling conversation
Yeah.
is that I take a ton of classes. I'm, like, constantly trying to work on myself. And in these classes and in these spaces that are, like,
Yeah.
not like I'm volunteering all the time, but, like, a political engagement or whatever, it's like, it's almost all women. It's, like,
Yeah.
95% women.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, maybe you're
You fix
struggling
it. Like, yeah.
because you're not
You're not doing it. Yeah. And I think it's really, and I look, I'm with you. I empathize. And sometimes it's really hard to have sympathy. You're just like, oh God, just, if you would do something about this, then just like fix it. And I do think that's also true. I think that, humans need to take personal responsibility. But I think there is a way in which we can look at this where it's like, when we see women not showing up in, say, as computer programmers or
Mm-hmm.
in science or in sports or whatever it is that are sort of male coded, we look at systemic reasons for that. We're
Mm-hmm.
like,
Mm-hmm.
what are the pipelines? What are the messages that girls are getting? What are the ways they're being socialized? What are the barriers to entry? What are the sort of social costs to doing that, et cetera, et cetera. And when we look at men and why they may not show up in a self-help seminar that's full of women, we tend to sort of, or like on the left, often like see it as an individual problem rather than a systemic problem. So
Yeah.
we blame them, which is really tempting to do. And often like men really do their best to like, you know, or like,
Not engender your sympathy.
yes, I mean there is some where I'm like, buddy, I am really, really working to get you some sympathy on this earth, and please work with me because this is not helping, and you are straining my patience. But I'm trying really hard, and like in for the book. So one of obviously a very extreme manifestation of this is like the incel movement. You know,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't know how many of your like listeners know what that is, but we've probably all heard at this point. These guys who are super online, they can't get women, they're involuntarily celibate, they're lonely. They're a sort of very extreme version of a kind of trend, the whole male loneliness crisis thing, and they are like unsympathetic doesn't even begin to cover it. These guys are misogynistic. They are often like white supremacists. They're often involved in like some really horrific stuff. Not always, to be clear, not all of them, not all, but there are like things on those message boards which are so toxic. And for the book, I wanted to interview some of them to really like talk to them, and not in a kind of like gotcha kind of way. Like I didn't want to get like caught up in arguing with an incel about whether women are terrible or not. I feel like that's kind of right. I wanted to like talk to them about their real experience in the world and like try to find out like how did you get here? What
Mm-hmm.
is going on? And it was really interesting to just hear how much pain and trauma has happened as a result of masculinity, as a result of masculine expectations and other things. Like the more extreme incels often have some genuine trauma in often sexual trauma or extreme bullying, extreme violence, that kind of things. But like being the expectations of masculinity and the kind of violence of masculinity and what it does to boys and male psyches. And, I think there are layers and layers and layers of defense about how you survive in this system when you're not one of its winners. And it gave me a huge amount of empathy, I think. And you know, that this is a tricky one, and I don't think it's certainly not a competition, but like I wrote this line in the book which I keep coming back to, which is just like under patriarchy, men get everything except the thing that's most worth having, which is like that deep vulnerability and human connection, which women are allowed to access in this system. Like
Mm-hmm.
we are not always, not in every situation, but in general, as human agents, we're allowed to be emotionally vulnerable, we're allowed to be sensitive, and we're allowed to connect very, very deeply with other human beings. And so men get power, and power's great. And like, I absolutely want to advocate for women to have more power in this world. Don't get me wrong. But like, when it comes to your real, like, psychological health in this world, like, power is not everything. We kind of overvalue power and undervalue like emotion and connection, and how important they are. And I think it becomes this like circular thing where it's like because we value what men value, we value power. And so we think that if women don't have power, that's a real loss. We undervalue what women value, which is
Mm-hmm.
like emotion, connection, et cetera, et cetera. So when men don't get that, we don't even register it as a real loss. We're starting to. And things have changed even since I started writing this book. But, I think what men lose under patriarchy really are some of the absolute fundamentals of a healthy, emotionally, psychologically healthy life.
Totally. So, we've you touched on this with the incel movement, but like the internet is unavoidable. We're living in
Yeah.
this algorithmic toxicity of like Andrew Tate and
Ugh,
red
yeah.
pill content and like all kinds of YouTube radicalization. So, like,
Yeah.
as a boy mom, how did you approach the internet with your kids and like try to, I don't know, have them develop a masculinity that didn't feel like it needed to be censored, but, wasn't
Yeah.
sending them down a rabbit hole?
Yeah, it's really, really hard. And I don't think this is like, to be realistic, I don't think I can, again, be like, here's 3 tips for how to
Uh-huh.
like make
Yeah.
sure your son is never rampant. I think this is part of a like evolving relationship that you have with your child, and values based and connection based. What I say when people are like, how do I talk to my sons about Andrew Tate, or how do I talk to my sons about masculinity influences? And there are, like, to be clear, there are some great books and resources on that. And like Christopher Pepper and Joanna Schroeder have a great book called Talk to Your Boys, which gives you like scripts on literally how to have those conversations with them. But what I would say is like 99.9% of your like keeping your boys out of the manosphere and talking to them about Andrew Tate happens outside of those conversations.
Mhm.
It's about the relationship you build with them. It's about the connection you have with them. It's about like, you know, giving space for their emotions, connecting, talking to them. It's all the stuff that happens outside, the relationship that you build with them, so that when you do have those conversations, you have this foundation of this deeply connected relationship with them. So they actually care about what you have to say. And I think there is this weird temptation, so, one thing that I talk about a lot is that I think boys in this like current moment get it kind of from both sides. So it's like, on the one hand, you've got this sort of older narrative of masculinity, which is just like, man up,
Mhm.
shut up, don't talk about your emotions, keep it inside, be a man, be tough, be strong. And then, so that's like one way to kind of shut them down emotionally. But then on the left, you have this thing, which is just like a kind of shut up, your problems don't matter, give space to everybody else. It's time for, stop mansplaining. Time for you to be quiet and let everybody else have a voice, which comes from a better place, but actually also means that boys feel like they can't really talk about these things. And I think it becomes, so you got like man up over here, you got shut up over there. And it's just like, we don't know how to be. We just like really just shut down emotionally. So I think one thing that I would say is like for parents, like talking to their sons and who are broadly on the left, it's like really try to censor any, like, I think most people aren't saying like men are terrible, but like, that kind of talk around boys is really, really harmful, and approach them with curiosity, like, what is your genuine experience in the world? What is it about this content that appeals to you? Often it's like not what you think,
Mhm.
it's not that they're like hate women and are like want to be misogynist. It's just like the fitness stuff really appeals,
Mhm.
or whatever it is. So it's sort of approaching it with curiosity, but definitely absolutely not bringing any shame into the equation. I think once you start trying to control someone's behavior with shame, then you're losing, you're losing them, losing their relationship, you're losing everything. Remember that these are children that we're talking about. They're
Mhm.
not Harvey Weinstein. They're not, they are like kids who are trying things out, who have, you know, so I think, curiosity. Oh, is that your?
There's a drill downstairs.
Oh.
I th I think that approaching with curiosity and, like, not shaming, that's so good. I even find, like, in this political moment,
Yeah.
not like, we're gonna have to come together in a way where we don't
Yeah.
disagree. Oh, what a buzzkill of a drill.
I
Um
try.
we'll wrap this up, but I guess if you could just leave people with what's one thing that gives you hope about this next generation of boys that yeah.
So I interviewed maybe like 50 boys or so for this book, and I thought this was going to be the most like blood from a stone. Like I thought it was going to be terrible. I was expecting these like numbskulls who were like monosyllabic and disengaged. And what I found was a group of like incredibly thoughtful, incredibly like articulate boys who just felt really shut down. They were just waiting for someone to listen to them, and they were not toxic. They were not, and even when they did sort of express opinions that I disagreed with, they really gave me hope as a group of people, considering what they've been up against, and what has been beaten out of them. I was really like, wow, you've managed to keep your humanity intact. And I think if we can just work with that, then I feel positive about the future.
Yay. That's a great place to end. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And thank you so much, Ruth. I will see you on the other side.
Great to talk to you. Take care. Bye.